So there's some really fundamental, interesting questions that are being asked now when you come into space. I've been in commercial real estate for 15 years, and some of us have done multiple transactions together, and we never had this conversation about the types of workers before. It was really much client-driven in that you were telling us, the providers of real estate, what you needed. We went and showed you what was out there, and then a lot of this stuff happened later, if at all. We talk about standards, desks and workstation sizes. Most organizations had one or two. Certain people got offices, certain people got workstations, and that was kind of the end. The feedback that I've been hearing from a lot of folks who watch these types of presentations who are end users is, that's all well and good, but isn't it really expensive? How do I afford this? We are a not-for-profit organization. We have no money in our capital budget for these kind of things. Darren, it's great. I love going down to ABI showroom and seeing this stuff, but the CFO is going to, well, I know what the CFO is going to do if I suggest it. So one of the things that kind of came up for us, as I spent some time in the showroom, is I realized that what is happening is folks are getting smaller. The tenants, as they are adopting some of these types of environments, are really not occupying the same footprint anymore, but yet, and your presentation, Joel, is fantastic. Did you notice that there was no real deep dive into the impact on the real estate requirement? So that's where we really try to bridge, is really starting to understand how that works. So this is why people are spending a little bit more time on it, not only in the increase of productivity, but and some of this stuff you're going to see parallels in part with what Yoel covered at the beginning, because it is part of a broader discussion, a broader vocabulary that we in real estate and facilities are having about how we go into space. What I've found is that really people got lost a little bit in the rush to technology. Some really fundamental things started to happen with how we used office space, and it wasn't really people focused for a very long time. It was really on the function. But I want to leave you with this thought, and if you really think about one thing, this is the one that I want you to pay attention to. Think of in your minds right now, over the last 10 years of your career, the things that you've been using in your office space just to get your work done. I'm willing to bet that whatever technology, be it the phones and whatever you started using 10 years ago, isn't in your office anymore. And if it is, you point to it and go, remember those? We all used to have one of these. And it really changed the way we operated in our office. It's funny how close this picture was to yours, and we didn't actually get together and plan this in advance. We've been moving really fast. This is a shot from Mad Men. I really like Mad Men because it gives us a time capsule into office space, and it's probably trademarked, so don't tell anybody. But what used to be cutting edge and modern in our office and normal is really different than it is right now. If these ladies showed up at your office today, in fact, probably you would be calling security and looking at them like they're dinosaurs. And this wasn't all that long ago. Then we migrated to the workstation. And it's been an interesting migration. But look at the computer. What I've noticed is that the buying cycles of a lot of organizations with respect to technology, have outpaced their buying cycles for furniture. You all like to talk about, it's steel, there's warranties, this stuff is really good, and it lasts. It should last. You spend a lot of money on it. But you change this stuff a lot faster. So here's what we see a lot of. This is not a bad example, especially as, and I want to clarify that a lot of the discussion that's been going on about facilities has been typically targeted at things like neocon, at very large, big organizations that oftentimes take a bit of a top-down approach towards staffing and seating. The CEO or the management team tell their employees how they're going to work. Well, that doesn't necessarily work for small and medium enterprise, and a lot of you don't go to those conferences. So we're trying to bring some of that ideas to you. But let's look at this workspace as an example. It used to have these big bulky monitors in it. I don't see them in your spaces anymore. I sometimes see them in the storage room, but in the last couple of years, we've gotten rid of a lot of these. it was designed to store a lot of things. We're not quite paperless yet. I don't know that in some of our organizations will ever be, but we have a lot less paper than we used to. We got a gentleman here from Price Waterhouse. You think of a lot of industries out there, accounting, professional services is one of the most paper-heavy that you get. Well, they've integrated a clean desk policy in their office to promote a little bit of that telework, but it's had, just to get to that, think of all the changes that you would have to get to have a clean desk every single night before you left. Where would you put your stuff? So we see a lot of this. Old furniture, itty-bitty screens, and a lot of empty surfaces. This one, I think if I look at it, is probably an 8x8. You notice the chairs facing the corner where the big monitor used to sit. We see a lot of purses, one plant. We don't have overhead bins in this picture, but one of my favorite things to do is to open people's bins when I go into their office. And they always get embarrassed when there's like a lunch bag or a pair of shoes, DOS, Windows manuals. It's like really old stuff, really key. So to reiterate, that technology that we use to do our job has really changed, but we're still at the same desk in a lot of cases. Now, Ottawa, I think, tends to lag behind some of the other markets where it's a bit more of a fast-paced environment. There's people out there going to these kind of things. Ottawa has really been driven by the federal government. Until the government does anything, most of Ottawa gets a little bit scared and doesn't quite hide under their desk, but is really afraid to be early adopters. We're not an early adopter type market. But since Workplace 2.0, and if you've have any interaction with us or been dealing with the government has really come into play. They changed their workplace standard about 2 or 3 years ago and have been busy ramming it down the throats of the department. It's kind of trickled out there, and some of us had some conversations earlier, that there's a different way of doing it. We don't necessarily know how to get there. We've heard some trends today, but we don't necessarily know how to bring some of those discussions into our workplace. So, well, some of the reasons that this is really coming up is your business or your organization is a lot different than it used to be in that there's a lot more uncertainty in your business model. Member-driven organizations, sales cycles, everybody's crystal ball is a little bit foggier and is a little bit trickier to decide, let's make a 10-year commitment to an office building. Let's spend a couple of $100,000, a couple of million to buy all new everything within that space. And this is the comment we get. I alluded to it earlier. Actually, I was pretty blunt. Furniture is thought of being as expensive. When you look at this, remember we said before, we talked about how furniture was it was about function. It was about efficiency. It was about getting the job done. There's an aesthetic quality. There's a look and feel to it that is now allowing organizations to make statements about their space, about their culture from the furniture rather than the office space. But we don't really compare the cost of that waste office space. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to do a little bit of math now. It's pretty easy. We walk you through it step by step, but I think you'll be surprised at some of the results. So I use an 8x6 workstation, not because I've gone out and done research to say this is what most of you have, but we've walked in your offices. We've spent time with you. Certainly in Ottawa, if you bought your furniture 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of folks were buying this, and it's quite amazing how as many innovative, creative cultures, the CEO went and got the cheapest furniture he could get from his last company. You see stuff that looked like it came out of people's basements that they had when they were in university, and there's almost this bootstrapping pride associated with it. It's, we've had this stuff for 25 years and it still works. And there's some heads nodding from the furniture reps in the room. Again, we looked at how the chair was facing the corner, designed for the big, bulky monitor. Now, here's a 6x6. At a quick glance, you might not have even have noticed that there's a difference, but there is. We replaced the large monitor with a flat screen. You get away with the deep corners. This is, I wouldn't even call this Design 101. This is the most simplest bit of design thinking that you're going to get at all. But when I bring folks down to the showroom, I often don't even tell them how big the workstations are. So what do you think of this? Could you see your people working in there? Do you think they would be unhappy And they often are surprised at how beautiful the product looks like, how engaging it is. And this is a pretty straightforward looking piece of product. But it's 25% smaller than the footprint of the other one. Now let's look at a 10 by 15 office. We've seen a lot of these in your office space. It's very normal. There hasn't been a lot of challenge from the design community in Ottawa when they're interacting with you in that we often, having sat in many of these meetings with interior designers in Ottawa, the client says, or the designer says, I need 10 offices, or how many offices do you need? The client says 10, and the designer says, well, how big an office do you need? The answer we see the most often is the client looks around at the room and says, well, how big is this one? The designer pulls out a tape, says it's 10 by 15, and the tenant says, is that good? Yeah, it's about normal. Okay. And that's the amount of pushback that we get. I think part of it comes from that in a local community where the federal government tells you how big to build it, there isn't a lot of culture from the furniture community, from the design community. It's not even permitted in the tender process to go back and say, you know, there's maybe a better way of doing this, you could save some money. That's not their world. So it's not part of the culture that gets you the desk that you're ultimately going to sit on. But take a look at this. You know, we've got a big swinging door. There's a lot of circulation space to get around the meeting room table that's built into the end of the surface. So now let's look at something a little bit different. We've got it's hard to see here, but there's a sliding door. You'll see a picture in a second. You know, functionally, this office serves pretty much the same function as the other one. But it's 12.5% smaller. These don't seem like big deals. So let's take a look at what this means. So I think this is around 20,000 feet. No, I don't exactly have the exact number. We've got 16 10 by 15 offices in here. We've got 136 8 by 6 cubicles. So remember what we did? This works out to about 12,300 square feet. So we swap these out. This is an example of an 8 by 8. You know, for a smaller station. And this is in fact, as I'm looking at it, is a bit of an older one. Or something like this. You know, these are some examples of the kind of environments that we can create. And I put some of these graphics together probably about a year ago. And aside from being beautiful, it's really hard to quantify what in the heck difference does this make. So remember, here comes the math part again. We reduced the cubicles from 8 by 6 to 8 by 8, and then we reduced the offices by about 12.5%. This saved us about 4,000 feet. Now, the important thing that, again, coming from the brokerage background that I have, we think in rentable area, whereas most everybody else in facilities and design thinks about usable area. The difference is the rentable area includes your proportionate share of the hallways and washrooms that are out the ground floor lobby of the building. It gets added into your usable area to create a rentable area. So every time I save you a usable square footage, there's 12 to 15% that gets tacked on in terms of actually calculating your rent. And it's important. In a typical multi-tenant environment, 12 to 15% is really normal. If you have a full floor, 6 to 7%. And since you pay rent on the rentable area, it's really important in your ultimate discussion when you're comparing dollars to focus on the rentable area, whereas the community that's putting a lot of this stuff together lives in usable area. They don't get to charge you for carpet out in the hallway, you know, if you're not paying for it. But this adds another 500 square feet to the math we were doing. So really, by changing just a couple of things, in this scenario, we've shaved off about 4,500 feet. And the best part about percentage savings is that size really does matter. We don't do what we found is by going through some of this analysis with our clients, they are often in about 20 to 30% more actual space than they really need. But the real dollar savings when you're a 2,000 foot tenant as opposed to an 8,000 or a 10,000 or a 50,000 foot client is usually not enough to actually warrant changing all your culture and going through some of the, you know, the planning and the cultural shifts that are required to get to some of these new environments. But what we've often found is the cost of getting into all new everything. When you consider in this type of situation, I used $35 a foot of total rent. That's about a Class B building downtown right now, a 130 Albert Street, 275 Slater. These are normal buildings. These guys are saving $1.5 million over a 10-year period. What we found is the cost of replacing the furniture, when you take this into account, is usually paid for in about 1.5 to 2 years. The other part that the furniture designers and vendors really don't talk about is the financing options that are out there. We are in lease financing, but we never really talked to the folks who sell the seats, how their industry worked. So since you can finance their product, if you're a cash flow driven organization, you can actually save money on day one and have all new everything. So that's why people are looking at this. So we found over time that tenants are getting smaller. We found that they're typically in 20 to 30% more space than they might need if they go through this. What we have found, though, is as we start introducing concepts of hot desking, telework, there's a bit of a fear there. If I make all your workstations a little bit smaller, more efficient really, and improve the general layout, you don't have to, as a manager, come up with, how do I deal with the chances of only having 5 desks and 7 people showing up for work? So what we've found is that by going through this with you, we are, in some cases in smaller organizations, adopting elements of some of the broader trends that are out there. And that's the transition step that you might take before you say, well, how do I only seat 80% of my people? You know, are we prepared to do clean desk policies to allow for the fact that when you're in Toronto, the office knows about it and might sit a visitor there? If you're not, you can still take advantage and there's still some savings to be had. So we're hoping, you know, afterwards and later and over the next few weeks that we have a bit of a conversation, because I can tell you, you're probably in too much office space and we can prove it. Thank you.